Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar, which is hosted by APA's Division 52, International Psychology. This webinar is part of an ongoing series to celebrate activities of psychologists around the world to provide useful information for international engagement and to encourage us all to take a broad and global perspective. My name is Dr. Karen Brown, and I, along with Dr. Falu Rami, are your co-hosts for today's webinar. Before we begin, our online audience will have the ability to ask questions by typing them into the chat box located in the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you please use the chat box rather than the Q&A box so that we can readily see your questions as we go through the presentation. Please feel free to type your questions in during the presentation, and we will be making a note of them, organizing them. And during the last part of this presentation, Dr. Rami will present them to our speaker for discussion. At this time, I turn the webinar over to Dr. Rami as she introduces and welcomes our guest speaker for today.
Thank you so much. It's my utmost pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Paul Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes is an associate professor of clinical psychology at the University of Sydney, who specializes in integrating psychotherapeutic practice with critical, community, and cultural psychology. His research work covers a wide variety of fields, including eco-anxiety, the psychology of place, the recovery movement, embodiment research, family therapy for anorexia and nervosa, and innovations in qualitative inquiry. His presentation discusses the rise of existential thought that occurred in direct response to the global trauma of World War II, given man's search for meaning after atrocity and holocaust. The existentialist discourse casts a long shadow, adapting to deal with contemporary problems, building on the canon, but integrated with the postmodern thought of Foucault, given the mutual opposition to structuralism. In contemporary times, however, we are dealing with new forms of global catastrophes in the form of climate change and COVID-19. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Rhodes. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, it's nighttime here in Sydney. I'm going to get started. Who am I? How can I be true to myself? How can I be authentic given the world I live in? These questions have been explored by existentialist philosophers, positioning courage in the face of dread as central to the development of a unique embodied identity, rather than being a fixed construct based solely on the circumstances of birth or prescribed roles and stereotypes. Identity is seen to be created after experience and despite anxiety, fleeting, liminal, a part of the continued process of individuation. In this talk, I'm going to trace the existentialist approach to identity from the spiritual dimensions of Kierkegaard and Tillich to the humanist self-determined reinvention of Sartre, from the temporal and storied conceptualizations of Heidegger and Ricoeur, highlighting our identity as a process of becoming, and onto the materiality and corporeal forms of identity of Merleau-Ponty. Any discussions of roles and stereotypes must also consider oppression and marginalization as primary threats to non-being, and I'll also consider critical existentialisms, including the feminism of Simone de Beauvoir and the post-colonial existentialism of Fanon. And lastly, and most importantly for our talk today, this will all lead towards us talking about the dynamics of identity from an existentialist position when we consider global dread, exploring the ways in which the anthropocentrism of traditional existentialism is inadequate for the crisis of climate and COVID-19. But let's start from the beginning. Kierkegaard was arguably the father of existentialism, explicating the search for selfhood well before the mainstay of the movement in the 20th century. He was also a Christian existentialist, paving the way for more contemporary religious thinkers such as Tillich and Bultmann and Barth. And for Kierkegaard, the greatest threat to finding one's identity was the doctrinal systems of the church, a focus on respectability and absolutes for him was an anathema to freedom. Kierkegaard considered Christianity to be a subjective experience, mystical, interior, emergent, and one that revealed the uniqueness of the individual rather than suppressing it for the crowd. The search for oneself was not a journey of the head, but one of the heart. It involved the experience of anguish and despair, the experience of isolation from self, and also resistance to being oneself, the separation from the person that God intends you to be. And this journey is necessarily filled with fear and trembling, anxiety resulting from the dizziness of freedom when one leaves the crowd behind. Paul Tillich was born 10 years after Kierkegaard died, but his career followed many similar themes: a man of faith, questioning the theism of the church in favor of the existential encounter. And for Tillich, God was not a being, but rather being itself, luminous and accessible again only through suffering. Tillich's ontology of courage had three types. Central is the capacity to face death anxiety, the recognition of our mortality. We are courageous when we seek our own answers for what will happen to us after death rather than relying on prescriptions. Secondly, moral courage, which comes from recognizing our failings but deciding to accept ourselves anyway. And thirdly, spiritual courage, the capacity to face the feeling that we have no place in the world and no purpose to exist. And for Tillich, self-affirmation is not a purely conscious act of the will, but rather an acceptance of these negative states before one enters into, quote, the state of being grasped by the power of being itself. Despite its origins in Christianity, however, classic existentialism is personified in Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, the humanists, focusing on identity as self-creation, based on personal choices, not an encounter with God. And for Sartre, the person in search of authenticity must find meaning in a world actually empty of God, standing alone in front of the abyss, abandoned. Selfhood comes from the choices one makes in the face of this terrifying freedom, molded by the ways one chooses to find meaning to understand what's happening to you. As Sartre famously put it, existence precedes essence. Our meaning-making cannot be found in human nature or predetermination, but can be constructed by us as we see fit. Heidegger's theory is similar, involving the same conflict between a retreat to our given state and one that is uniquely formulated. Heidegger argues that we are thrown into the world, born into a context that we did not choose, with beliefs and values and ideas that belong to the mass culture around us, inviting us to be passive. And if we follow, we experience fallenness, a foreclosure form of identity. We're lost to the public they. And this can be comforting, given that anxiety can be clouded by television and now the internet, news and gossip, each answering questions we never even asked. And for Heidegger, an authentic identity is the seen or being there, living actually in relation to the world while ultimately being alone. While Sartre and Heidegger shared much in their humanist view of identity, Heidegger introduced a temporality to the process that challenges the idea of the self as a fixed internalized selfhood. For him, subjectivity did not involve the development of an I set apart from the flow of time, but rather a subjectivity that might be best seen as experience, a momentary encounter with a changing contextual self. Human identity retains its historicity, a being in the world, perhaps also understood in the contemporary reading of the word grounded. Heidegger's the scene is open to the world and hence different from the interiority of Kierkegaard. Courage comes from actively revealing oneself in the public sphere, leaving one's private hiding place and showing who one is, exposing oneself. The humanist Paul Ricoeur is also concerned with this kind of temporality and identity, building on the work of Heidegger to develop his narratology. He argued against essentialist versions of the human subject, such as that of rational, isolated Cartesian cogito. Instead, he argued for a personal identity that's not stable, not fully stable, not self-transparent, but also not incoherent or self-alienated. For him, the self-relationship is achieved through narration, an active interpretation in the present, rather than fully autonomous self-authoring. Narrative means more than simply a story, but refers to the way that humans experience time, the way we mentally organize our sense of the past and understand our future potentialities. In this sense, our identity only exists where the past meets the future. The process of becoming is all that really matters. When considering notions of identity, we can see that Ricoeur, while a narratologist, mirrored the anti-essentialist identity negotiations of his humanist peers, positioning the authentic human subject as self-narrator, resisting sedimentation in favor of innovation. And rather than negotiate between dogma and freedom, social mores and self-creation, Ricoeur's ontology involved one between retrospect and prospect. Like Heidegger, one of Merleau-Ponty's concerns when considering the question of being was to situate consciousness in the materiality of the world, rescuing it from abstract introspection. Heidegger was a friend of Merleau-Ponty, however, and is perhaps best known for his work on embodiment, of course, arguing that notions of identity and being cannot be separated from the corporeal. This has significant implications, ushering in the body rather than Freud's dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. The body, as Reggie Ray puts it, is the unconscious, not only in the smaller but also in the larger sense. The body is ultimately our largest person. From this position, the discovery of identity cannot be done without considering the incarnate nature of subjectivity. Without Descartes' dualism, we are left to seek non-dissociative forms of identity, which account for the fact that we are inseparable from our skin. Embodiment theory shifts the vantage point from abstraction to materiality. Identity starts with the subjective experience of the body subject, experientially aware and connected to the sensations of the flesh. This brief history of identity from an existentialist perspective reveals a shift in focus from interiority to situatedness, from mysticism to contextualization of selfhood in the context of time and narrative, but also the material world of perception, action, and flesh. Courage is conceptualized as resistance across this history to church dogma, to the conformity of the masses, to the fragmentation of disembodiment, in favor of an encounter with anxiety, aloneness, and liminality. The identity that emerges is not fixed, but found in God or hermeneutic, fleeting, narrative, and felt. It is important to recognize that this classic era of existentialist thought, while radical in its humanism, did not grapple with identity diversity as we now know it. It was primarily a white male endeavor, failing to consider subjectivities of gender, race, sexuality, and their intersection. Many of the thinkers discussed, however, did serve as critical starting points for more political existentialisms, willing to develop a complete theory regarding oppression and identity. Sartre, of course, influenced Simone de Beauvoir's feminist existentialism. Despite her vehement critiques of him, Sartre also influenced Frantz Fanon's Black existentialism, particularly his book, Anti-Semite and Jew. Merleau-Ponty also brought the body to identity, opening up existentialism to feminist, Black, and gender non-conforming bodies. Existentialism was to meet politics, and the subject had to reckon with patriarchal, racist, and homophobic forces in this existentialist journey towards authenticity. Existentialists also met Foucauldian postmodernity, whereby subjectivities created by disciplinary power could be transformed by experimental technologies of the self. It's fascinating that the revolution of second wave feminism of the 1960s was heavily influenced by Simone de Beauvoir, who studied the work of Kierkegaard and Heidegger with Sartre in France. Her feminist existentialism was explicated in her opus, The Second Sex, arguably the most important book of early feminism. For Beauvoir, the search for identity involves a reclaiming of embodied subjectivity from a patriarchal culture. Women are incidental as opposed to essential, and while man is the subject or self, a woman can only be the other. A woman is socialized to develop the identity of a doll, passive and timid, aiming to please and lacking in physical strength. These qualities are not her feminine essence, but created by civilization. Central to Beauvoir's thesis is the idea of the male gaze that constructs the objectified identity of a woman. This gaze, once internalized, means that the woman continue to produce her body as an object for others. If the identity of a woman is created by patriarchal society, however, it is not predetermined and therefore can be self-fashioned, involving the dismantling of a lifetime of socialization and challenging of the myth of woman. Contemporary phenomenologists like Judith Butler still owe much of their thinking to Beauvoir, including her proposition that gender is performative, built on social practices. This view resonates with the existentialist rejection of predetermined human nature and the notion of identity as reinvention, self-narrated or emergent. The performativity of identity is established through the historical repetition and stylization, making the appearance of innate traits, rendering other forms of identity as abject or illegitimate. In reality, one can resist this false naturalization through critical reflection, identity claims, and new modes of performativity. In this, Frantz Fanon, the world's leading Black existentialist thinker and activist, stated in his most famous book, Black Skin, White Mask, that Sartre's anti-Semite and Jew contained pages that were amongst the best he'd ever read. His aim, however, was to actually decolonize existentialism, given that colonialism was a total project which had rendered Black identity to the hell of non-being. Non-being, for Fanon, occurs through the epidermalization of inferiority or the internalization of racism. This project of negrification means that the oppressed person must navigate the world through whiteness, struggling for identity through white language, appearance, manners, and habits. And for Fanon, any recuperation of Black embodied subjectivity must be done as resistance to the imperializing dominant culture. There have been few contemporary challenges to the notion of identity more significant than the dismantling of gender as a biological given. The deconstruction of gender essentialism follows the historical existentialist discourse, given that it takes Sartre's reinvention to the corporeal. Simone de Beauvoir's statement that one is not born but rather becomes a woman exemplifies the existentialist radical commitment to identity reinvention, providing a philosophical starting point for the separation of gender from biological sex that has come to underpin contemporary gender politics. Judith Butler's seminal book, Undoing Gender, takes up the cause for gender performativity in relation to intersex and transgender individuals, arguing for an anti-foundational stylistics of existence. Hortailing positions sexuality from an existentialist frame as follows: sexuality through an ontology of becoming that takes into account the diverse, multifaceted nature of sexuality serves as a series of temporal experiences, attractions, desires, practices, and identities. This statement faces gender firmly in the humanist commitment to emerging notions of identity, unstable and always becoming. So the story of existentialism so far, the story of existentialist approach to identity so far has followed the shift from Christianity to humanism and then postmodernity. The self once found in God, interior, gradually shifts outwards, looking into the material world through the body with others into action. Eventually we arrive at Hannah Arendt's idea of amor mundi, whereby an active life involves breaking free from hegemony, not just in the area of consciousness, but also practice. The personal has become political. Despite these differences, however, a number of similarities can be ascertained in respect to the approach, with existentialism serving to provide the means to which subjects, historicized, can make sense of who they are. Firstly, identity is not seen as a fixed construct or trait, but rather emerges in opposition to such conceptualizations. Identity is the antithesis of essentialism, being found in the spiritual realm or in experience, momentary, narrated, an ontology of becoming. Secondly, essentialist notions are socially defined but positioned by the herd as givens. The human subject yearning for authenticity must resist these constructs in order to be free. The specific objects of resistance change with each paradigm. For Kierkegaard, this meant resistance to the church dogma and religious social conservatism. For Heidegger, the world one happened to be thrown into, and then on to the patriarchy, the colonial, and the heteronormative. The result, however, is a unique individual, self-created and self-determining. Well, now let us turn to the present and to global dread. To a large extent, the rise of existentialism occurred in direct response to the global trauma of World War II, given men's search for meaning after atrocity and Holocaust. In 1946, Sartre declared existentialism as a humanism, with men cast into a brave new godless world. The existentialist discourse cast a long shadow, adapting to deal with contemporary problems, built on the canon, but integrated with postmodern thought of Foucault, given the mutual opposition to structuralism. In contemporary times, however, we are dealing with new forms of global catastrophes in the form of climate change and COVID-19. What does existentialism have to offer now in terms of being in the world? What does it mean for identity? What does it mean to have the courage to be oneself in the face of these new threats? Let's start first with eco-existentialism and sustainable biographies. Glenn Albrecht in 2012 describes eco-existentialism as a new form of inquiry which responds to the dread we experience in the era of climate change, as we fear not our own mortality in this case, but the sustainability of all life on the planet. Excuse me. At its worst, we experience pre-traumatic terror in relation to the potential for eco-apocalypse. He describes this despair as psychotherapeutic, in that it no longer refers to an intrapsychic state, as in prior existentialist paradigms, but rather one that relates to our relationship to Earth. In the existentialist tradition, the existentialist tradition describes both authentic and inauthentic forms of existence. For Albrecht, the inauthentic is Anthropocene and the authentic is Symbiocene. The former, similar to Sartre's bad faith, involves an attempt to cope based on climate denialism, planetary death denial, and the maintenance of an anachronistic identity based on materialism. This form of defense involves the blind following of public denialists, numbing through digital forms of entertainment and even reactionary increases in consumerism. The latter, the Symbiocene identity, involves self-denial and the reconfiguration of our identity as one that is inherently biophilic, or involving the love of nature, or symbiophilic, involving a deep ingrained love of living in harmony with other species. For Albrecht, distress is at its most pronounced when one becomes frozen in between these states, acutely aware of the reality of the climate crisis, but unable to shift from anxiety and on to grief, and then finally, the reconfiguration to a Symbiocene identity. Like Arendt, this state does not only involve the recreation of an identity tied to place, but also direct action in terms of sustainability and activism. It is important to recognize the significance of this form of identity, one that mirrors Australian Aboriginal conceptualizations, but is new in the history of existentialist thought. From the wider perspective of European philosophy, it can best be understood as related to a post-human ontology, whereby the human being is no longer central, but one species amongst an assemblage of many. Let us say we have shifted from Heidegger's being in the world to being in the world with all its species. And now to COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic is the perfect storm for existentialist despair, not simply because it elicits a form of global dread, but because while threatening non-being, it simultaneously casts it into physical isolation from each other. If death comes, this isolation amplifies with family members excluded from the final moments. This dread, or as French and Monahan call it, dis-ease, is elevated to the apocryphal myth through digital hyperrealism in a century already primed by the semiotics of doom. Robertson Kremen named this the age of catastrophe, where dystopian dread is already primed by 9/11, Fukushima, Katrina, the refugee crisis. While these events cause real suffering, they are elevated to a monolithic myth through media-saturated simulation, through memes, CGI, blockbusters, and The Walking Dead. Dread is no longer related to original sin or the absurd, but a product of the cultural unconscious or semiosphere. It is important to recognize that moral panic and doomsday scenarios have long been a vehicle for social control, from Salem to AIDS to Trump's theocracy. The question remains as to how we can exercise self-affirmation in the face of both a real pandemic and a hyper-real apocalypse and what forms of identity might be possible. What might emerge as we work our way through the fright, grief, and post-traumatic reality of a changed world? What kind of heteroglossic possibilities are there after resistance to the freezing effects of a unitary, monolithic discourse? Arajiu argues that COVID-19 provides us with an opportunity to reconsider our relationships with multiple species, which make up the viral scape or the intercorporeal scenery. As with climate change, we must reject anthropocentrism in favor of a post-human identity demoted to an assemblage that now includes the microbial. It has been over 170 years since Kierkegaard wrote Fear and Trembling, but the father of existentialism introduced the world to a discursive resource that has maintained its relevance to the present crises. The individual faced with threats to his identity is drawn on this form of philosophical inquiry to inspire self-affirmation in the face of non-being, abandonment, and the transformational potential of dread. The threats have changed from the dogma and conformity of the church to the meaningless of war, to the erasure of sexism and racism and gender conformity, and contemporary global threats of climate crisis and the pandemic. Our response, however, need not change as we resist foreclosure and instead choose the path of self-reflection and authenticity. This is not an intellectual journey, however, but an experiential one involving uncertainty and loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhodes, for that conversation and that discourse.
No problem.
I have a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first question I have is, understanding Sartre's theory of existentialism that says we are defined by our actions. In your opinion, what does our actions during this pandemic say about us as a global village?
Oh my goodness. Depends what country you're talking about. And it depends on the individual. If you compare New Zealand to Florida, for example, you know, I think it speaks to cultural processes that are quite different. And, you know, you can see the differences across cultures that are leading to different forms of actions. It's quite fascinating. I'm not sure how further to answer that question, but we still have personal responsibility, you know, when it comes to responding, but not the diffusion of responsibility, which seems to be quite common.
So the next questions I have there, I don't know if you want me to read the whole thing. There's multiple questions to it. I'll read through it.
I can see some of them. Yes, I'm scared of Luca's question, but I'm going to try.
Yeah, I'm a little scared reading it too.
Even reading it's frightening.
So a little provocation. Isn't phenomenological existentialism pretty anthropocentric, insisting as consciousness as the origin of both despair and peculiarity of mankind? Aren't neo-positivist biological or evolutionary psychology in a certain sense more ecological, focusing on lower level of psychological life? I would say animal life in Aristotle's sense.
I really, Luca, I hate you for this question. It's so difficult. Yeah, I'm not sure. There are certain parts of that question I haven't thought about before, particularly how you know, evolution you know, plays into it. Yeah, it's very hard to answer. I guess I'm just generally interested in how our relationship to other species, including the microbial, you know, and obviously in climate change, the whole of our ecology is radically changed. You know, that we're no longer evolutionarily superior, but actually we've been cast into a position of part of the assemblage. I mean, that's my thinking on it. It's quite rudimentary, I think, but I can't. That's as far as I can go in answering Luca's cruel question towards me.
Thank you.
Did I do okay?
I think you did very well. So,
oh, thanks. I just spoke randomly.
So I have one.
Oh, this is a good one.
Well, no, this is another one actually.
Okay.
So I know you didn't speak about logotherapy, but I was wondering if you are familiar with it. How could logotherapy and existentialism be used to discuss coping with the suffering from COVID-19, redefine purpose, relationships, and finding meaning in this new way of being in the world?
Mm. That's a virtually impossible question to answer because I don't know what logotherapy is. But, you know, it's very interesting that I don't know because it speaks to the conservatism of Australian psychology where cognitive behavior therapy is so dominant, you know. And I mean, I come from a family therapy and community psychology background, which makes me a irrelevant person in the margins in mainstream psychology, but I couldn't answer that question. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on personal responsibility and the resistance to wearing masks to fight COVID-19 as a society?
Oh my goodness. You know, I think masks are to be worn for the sake of protecting other people, not yourself. So if you don't wear a mask, you're essentially selfish. That's what I believe. You know, it's essentially a selfish act, you know, and to me, it's a sign of a society's decadence and that people won't wear them. To me, it's, you know, we've lost all sense of humanism, you know, in that sense of caring for each other and of community. And it's simply an act of, it's individualism gone toxic, you know, where our rights are more important than people dying. You know, I mean, it's an obvious answer, but you know, it's a cruelty beyond imagining to me. You know? Yeah. Will that do?
Yes, that's fine.
Some of these questions are very sophisticated. I'm very impressed with the audience. Yeah,
you got a tough crowd here.
Some of them are much smarter than me.
So the next one is, are there additional foundational readings or authors you can share related to eco-existentialism? Additional thoughts about how invisible threats such as microbes, microplastics, or invisible pollutants influence mental health or identity development.
Well, it's quite hard to find, obviously, to find things on the pandemic and identity. I've been reading this Arregui, A-R-R-E-G-U-I. I've been reading him. I've been reading general kind of post-humanist theory because that's the lens through which I'm trying to understand what's going on. So I'm even like, reading Deleuze and Guattari, despite how much it's hurting me, how difficult it is. And I mean, I'm a massive fan of Glenn Albrecht. He's an Aussie, and he's been to my house for dinner, and he's kind of captured my imagination in terms of this existentialist approach to climate change and much more. So I'm not an expert on existentialism or climate change. In fact, it's only through the bushfires at the beginning of this year in Sydney that I first started reading about it, because it just seemed that we were all collectively experiencing dread. I mean, I read Kierkegaard when I was a 14-year-old, like many, well, maybe, or maybe I'm weird, but I'm just starting to grasp these issues, to be honest. And the act of writing this talk is my way of learning about them. So I'm really joining with the audience in learning. I can't quote lots of different references because I'm on this journey of trying to understand what's going on in Australia through bushfires and then COVID-19. But yeah, Glenn Albrecht's book, his book on eco-anxiety is remarkable. I highly recommend it.
Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. The next question I have is, how may we apply these concepts to encouraging care for ourselves and fellow humans through active acts such as mask wearing, social distancing, etc.? How would you explain resistance to such acts and relatedly science?
Yeah, well, I think I've spoken to that again, but it's a deeply cultural, like to call a mask a muzzle. I saw this on YouTube where this guy's calling a mask a muzzle. It's the perversion of your own American values, and it's a perversion of basic compassion towards other people. I just see it in humanist terms, if we're talking existentialism, as basic selfishness, and cruelty. I don't think it should be theorized beyond that. That's how I feel about it, and I'm proud in Australia that we have lockdown, and now we're locking down again. And as a community, we've actually shown that we can come together and care for the elderly, by self-sacrifice, obviously, New Zealand's even better than we are at it. So, we're a terribly cruel country to our Indigenous people and refugees, awful. But in this case, I'm proud of it. So, yeah. I'm doing my best here.
No, you're doing good. Thank you. Are there salient...
The questions are making me feel existentialist dread, if that helps.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Are there salient links in your mind between eco-existentialism and environmental justice efforts?
Yeah, I can answer that. We've done some research at my uni, me and my students, on narratives of activists, particularly looking at how activists grow into being such, and what the emotional processes are that they have to go through from when they were young to being activists. And you can see that there is this process of grief and reckoning, with what's really going on and facing it, and the enormous emotional pain that they go through, that many people don't want to go through. That does, for them, the only response can be action. So there is a process of going from grief to action, that seems very tied up in identity, that identity is a acting on the world. It's not kind of a Kierkegaardian spirituality without action, you know. So from we've interviewed quite a lot of people, young people, about this, and they do conceptualize their identity as action oriented and justice oriented. So it seems once you face climate change, it seems that that's, at least from our narrative research, what happens, you know. Yeah, good question. I could answer it.
Thank you. So I have another question. Can the anthropocenic and the symbiocenic understandings meet in the middle, and how does that occur?
This is very interesting. It's like Sven Brinkman, who says, you know, we need to be humanists in a post-human era. You know, like it's not, you know, like it's not a question of us becoming equals to frogs and microbes, you know, because we're all in this, we're no longer in the hierarchy. We have to become humanists within a post-human world. In other words, we can't dominate, but we have to hang on to our humanist values so that we can, you know, care for each other and for other species. I like this idea that, you know, we're not abandoning our humanity, we're rediscovering it in a new assemblage. And same with, you know, we have to still, we consider the uniqueness and power of being human, but still be transformed by a love of nature and an engagement with the reality of what we've done to nature through, you know, in the Symbiocene. So, you know, I think that answers it to a degree. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're just knocking ourselves off the pedestal, you know. It's quite interesting for me because as I was reading all of this, I moved from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, where I'm surrounded by bush and by fires. And so this journey has been a personal one as well, as I've kind of realized, moving from the city to the country, how to appreciate nature. And like many people, we're all growing vegetables for the first time. You know, we're starting to realize, hopefully, that we're part of nature, just like Indigenous Australians already know and have known for thousands and thousands of years.
Thank you. And should we block Luca from the last question? I'm just questioning.
That's not a bad question. I could try that one. Yeah. I'd never block Luca.
I'm just kidding. How are Aboriginal people in Australia dealing with COVID, for instance, compared to Brazil and USA, where it has been a real opportunity for genocidal governmental policies?
Yeah, better than that. I mean, as far as I understand, and I can, please correct me, there is an increased degree of vulnerability in Aboriginal communities because of the health gap that we have between, you know, white and Aboriginal peoples, and so there have been, you know, as far as I can recall, you know, quite serious lockdowns, you know, to protect some communities. As far as what they're doing in terms of self-determined way to deal with COVID, I don't know. I'm not aware of it. I just listened to my Aboriginal PhD student, and she takes the lockdown so incredibly seriously because she is supervised culturally by aunties and elderly people, and the respect for the elders is really incredible. And it's a respect that we don't have. We'll put them in nursing homes and kill them through not wearing masks, you know, screw them, you know. Whereas I observe her honouring of elderly people by a very serious personal lockdown, where she won't leave the home at all until the pandemic is lifted, out of respect, you know, for elders. So I think that's something very important. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhodes. Those are all the questions we have, and
Oh,
I was
thank
wondering,
God.
I was wondering if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to share with us, and I really appreciate this conversation that you brought.
Yeah, no, look, I'm just grateful for I find these talks an opportunity to get your own thinking together, you know, and to read more and to try and grapple with a subject that you only half know. So that's how I tend to treat the talks like this today. For me, it's a discovery too, you know, and I hope people found it interesting. I certainly found it interesting to think about and to write. So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks very much. And it's so nice to re-engage with America, because I have a deep love for and affection for America, and I go to Chicago every year, and I miss it. So thank you very much for the chance.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing a webinar for our division. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Brown for her final thoughts.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Listen, this has been very, very illuminating. It is so amazing to hear you speak, Dr. Rhodes. We thank you for coming on. We thank our viewing audience for participating, for the wonderful questions, and some of the things that were discussed. We appreciate you spending this hour with us, this past
I think
hour.
I told you that it's midnight and I actually have my pajamas on underneath my suit.
Yes, you did. But so you can get away with it now, right?
Oh, I can go, yeah, because I've given my talk now. So
oh, yeah. So we thank our audience for your participation. We would love to hear back from you concerning the concept and the format of this webinar. Please let us know how you feel about it, and if you want more of it, and we'll be really excited to have Dr. Rhodes back again in the future. And so we want all of you to understand that this is your these are your webinars. So let us know what you want to hear. Let us know if these things are good for you. If you like what you hear, if you like what you're saying, just let us know. And again, Dr. Rhodes, thank you so much. Hopefully you will consent to come back and talk with us again. And maybe we'll come up with a time that's a little earlier for you.
Can I have my glass of wine now?
Oh yes, absolutely. You've earned it. You've earned it. Yes, you've earned it. So on behalf of the Div52 webinar committee, and also our COVID partners, task force partners, we wish you a very, very great upcoming weekend. And Dr. Rhodes, you can start yours now. Woo! And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your evening. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.